Sarah Mitchell adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and smoothed down her navy blue dress as she walked through the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge, Montana. The year was 1952, and the small town buzzed with the kind of gossip that could make or break a person's reputation. At 32, Sarah had earned respect as the town's dedicated schoolteacher, but that respect came with a heavy burden she carried every single day. The whispers followed her wherever she went. They started softly, like the rustle of autumn leaves, but grew louder with each passing year. "Poor Sarah," the women would say as they gathered around the general store. "Such a shame she never married, must be something wrong with her." Others were less kind. "A woman her age with no children, it's not natural, what's she hiding?" Sarah had heard every variation of these cruel comments. She knew exactly what they thought of her, and it cut deeper than any physical wound ever could. The truth was something she could never share, a secret that would destroy not just her reputation, but her entire life in this tight-knit community. As she pushed open the heavy wooden door of the schoolhouse, Sarah tried to shake off the morning's encounter with Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife. The woman had cornered her outside the post office, her voice dripping with false concern. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Henderson had said, her beady eyes gleaming with malicious curiosity, "I was just telling my Herbert how unusual it is for a woman of your age to remain so unattached. Surely there must have been suitors over the years, or perhaps you're just too particular." The implication was clear. In a world where a woman's worth was measured by her ability to catch a husband and bear children, Sarah's single status made her an object of suspicion and pity. She had smiled politely and excused herself, but the words burned like acid in her chest. Inside the classroom, 23 young faces looked up at her expectantly. These children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, were her world. She loved each one of them with a fierce protectiveness that their own mothers might never understand. Tommy Rodriguez, whose father worked the railroad, struggled with reading but showed incredible promise in mathematics. Little Emma Walsh had lost her mother to consumption last winter and clung to Sarah during recess, seeking the maternal comfort she desperately missed. "Good morning, class," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "Today we're going to continue our study of the Oregon Trail. Can anyone tell me why pioneers decided to make such a dangerous journey west?" Hands shot up eagerly, and Sarah felt the familiar warmth that teaching brought her. This was where she belonged, where she made a difference. These children didn't care about her marital status or judge her for choices she had never actually made. They simply saw Miss Mitchell, the teacher who stayed late to help them with their lessons and who always had a kind word when they struggled. The morning passed quickly as Sarah guided her students through arithmetic problems and geography lessons. During recess, she watched them play in the schoolyard, their laughter echoing across the prairie grass that surrounded the small building. This was her family, she told herself. This was enough. But as the children lined up to return to class, Sarah noticed a familiar figure approaching the schoolhouse. Margaret Foster, the preacher's wife, marched across the yard with the determination of a woman on a mission. Sarah's stomach tightened. Mrs. Foster was the unofficial leader of the town's moral committee, a group of women who appointed themselves guardians of community standards. "Miss Mitchell," Mrs. Foster called out, her voice carrying across the yard. "I need to speak with you, it's quite urgent." Sarah instructed her students to take their seats and begin copying the afternoon's spelling words from the blackboard. She stepped outside to meet Mrs. Foster, whose stern expression promised nothing good. "I've been speaking with the other school board wives," Mrs. Foster began without preamble. "We're concerned about your influence on the children, a woman in your position, teaching young girls about their future roles as wives and mothers. It seems inappropriate, don't you think?" The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "I don't understand, Mrs. Foster. My students consistently achieve the highest test scores in the county. Their parents seem quite satisfied with their progress." Mrs. Foster's lips pursed into a thin line. "Academic achievement isn't everything, Miss Mitchell. Children need proper role models. They need to see what a godly woman looks like, a woman who has fulfilled her natural duties as a wife and mother." "I believe I am a proper role model," Sarah replied, fighting to keep her voice calm. "I teach them kindness, honesty, and the value of education. I encourage them to think for themselves and to treat others with respect." "But you're not married," Mrs. Foster said bluntly. "At your age, that sends a message. The children, especially the girls, might begin to think that marriage and motherhood are optional, that they can simply choose to remain spinsters like you. The word spinster hung in the air like a curse. Sarah had been called worse things behind her back, but hearing it spoken so plainly to her face was devastating. She thought of all the young girls in her class, bright minds full of potential, and imagined them being told that their only value lay in finding a husband. "Mrs. Foster," Sarah said carefully, "perhaps we have different views on what constitutes a fulfilled life. I believe that every person, man or woman, should be free to pursue their calling. Teaching is my calling." Mrs. Foster's eyes flashed with anger. "Your calling? Miss Mitchell, a woman's calling is clear as day in the scriptures. She is to be a helpmeet to her husband and a mother to his children. Anything else is just selfish rebellion against God's plan." Conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Both women turned to see a rider approaching the schoolhouse. Sarah didn't recognize him, but in a town the size of Cedar Ridge, strangers were noticed immediately. The man was tall and lean, sitting his horse with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his life in the saddle. His dark hair was slightly longer than fashion dictated, and his clothes, while clean and well-maintained, marked him as a working cowboy rather than a town dweller. He tipped his hat politely as he dismounted. "Ladies, I'm looking for Miss Mitchell. I was told she teaches school here." "I'm Miss Mitchell," Sarah said, grateful for the interruption. "How can I help you?" The cowboy's eyes were a striking blue-green, the color of deep water, and when he looked at her, Sarah felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. He had a kind face, weathered by sun and wind but free of the hardness she often saw in men who worked the range. "I'm Jake Thompson, ma'am. I've taken a job at the Double Bar Ranch just outside town. The foreman, Mr. Hollies, mentioned that you might have some books I could borrow. I'm hoping to improve my reading skills." Mrs. Foster sniffed disapprovingly. Cowboys who read books, whatever next. Jake's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught a flash of something in his eyes. "I reckon there's no law against a man wanting to better himself, ma'am, even a cowboy." "Of course there isn't," Sarah said quickly. "I'd be happy to recommend some books, Mr. Thompson. Perhaps you could come by after school hours. I stay late most days to prepare lessons." "I'd appreciate that, Miss Mitchell. Thank you kindly." As Jake remounted his horse and rode away, Mrs. Foster turned back to Sarah with renewed disapproval. "Now you're encouraging rough cowboys to hang around the schoolhouse. Really, Miss Mitchell, your judgment becomes more questionable by the day." "Mr. Thompson seems like a perfectly respectable man who wants to improve his education," Sarah replied. "I fail to see how that's objectionable." Mrs. Foster gathered her skirts dramatically. "Mark my words, Miss Mitchell, the school board will be hearing about this. A single woman your age making arrangements to meet privately with strange men. It's scandalous." She marched away, leaving Sarah standing alone in the schoolyard. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, but Sarah felt cold all the way through. The walls were closing in around her, and she didn't know how much longer she could maintain the facade that her life was anything close to normal. Back in the classroom, Sarah tried to focus on the afternoon's lessons, but her mind kept wandering. She thought about Mrs. Foster's threats, about the ongoing pressure to explain her single status, and about the growing hostility she sensed from some members of the community. Most troubling of all, she thought about the secret she carried, the reason she could never marry, never have children of her own in the conventional sense. When school ended and the last child had been collected by their parents, Sarah remained at her desk, grading papers and preparing for the next day's lessons. The late afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the gentle knock on the door. "Miss Mitchell." Sarah looked up to see Jake Thompson standing in the doorway, hat in hand. He looked uncertain, as if he might be intruding. "Mr. Thompson, please come in. I was just finishing up." Jake stepped into the classroom, his eyes taking in the neat rows of desks, the alphabet posted along the walls, and the globe sitting on a table near the window. "Nice schoolhouse. Looks like a good place to learn." "I like to think so," Sarah said, rising from her desk. "You mentioned you were interested in borrowing some books." "Yes, ma'am, I can read some, but I'm not what you'd call skilled at it. Never had much schooling as a boy. My pa died when I was 12, and I had to work to help support my mother and sisters." There was no self-pity in his voice, just a matter-of-fact statement of circumstances that had shaped his life. Sarah found herself curious about this quiet cowboy who wanted to improve himself. "What kind of books interest you?" Jake looked slightly embarrassed. Well, I've always been curious about history, and maybe some stories if you have any that aren't too difficult. Sarah moved to the bookshelf that lined one wall of the classroom. I think I have just the thing. She selected several volumes. This one is about the Civil War, written in simple language, and these are adventure stories that my older students enjoy. They're exciting but not too challenging. Jake accepted the books gratefully. I'll take good care of them, Miss Mitchell. You have my word. I'm not worried about that, Sarah said, and she meant it. There was something inherently trustworthy about this man. Take your time with them. When you're ready for more, just let me know. As Jake prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. Miss Mitchell, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but that woman outside earlier seemed pretty upset with you. I hope it wasn't on my account. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mrs. Foster has strong opinions about many things. Please don't concern yourself with her disapproval. Jake nodded slowly. In my experience, people who are quick to judge others usually have something they're trying to hide themselves. A good person doesn't need to tear others down to feel better about their own life. The unexpected wisdom in his words surprised Sarah. She had assumed, as most townspeople would, that a cowboy would be simple, uneducated, perhaps rough around the edges. But Jake Thompson seemed to possess an understanding of human nature that many so-called educated people lacked. Thank you for saying that, Sarah said softly. It's been a difficult day. Well, tomorrow's a new day, Jake said with a gentle smile. And from what I can see, those children are lucky to have you as their teacher. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. After he left, Sarah stood in the empty classroom for a long time, thinking about their brief conversation. It had been years since anyone had offered her such simple, genuine kindness without expecting something in return. The loneliness she usually kept buried threatened to overwhelm her. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment above Miller's Dry Goods, where she rented 2 modest rooms. She prepared a simple dinner and tried to grade papers, but her concentration was scattered. Through her thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Miller talking to her daughter about wedding preparations for a cousin in Billings. The conversation was filled with excitement about flowers, dresses, and the wonderful life that awaited the bride. Sarah had once dreamed of such things. When she was 18, fresh out of normal school and full of hope for the future, she had imagined that teaching would be temporary, something to do until the right man came along. She had pictured herself married by 25, with children of her own by 30. Life, however, had had different plans. The secret she carried was like a weight in her chest, growing heavier with each passing year. It wasn't that she had never had opportunities for marriage. There had been 2 men, actually, who had shown serious interest. Both had been kind, decent men who would have made good husbands. Both had wanted children, had spoken enthusiastically about the large families they hoped to have. Sarah had broken both engagements, unable to explain why she couldn't go through with the weddings. How could she tell them the truth? How could she explain that she was physically incapable of bearing children, a fact she had learned from the doctor in Helena during a terrible illness when she was 24? The sympathetic physician had been gentle but clear. Damage from the fever meant she would never conceive. In 1952, in a small Montana town, such a revelation would make her unmarriageable. No man would want a wife who couldn't give him children. It would be seen as a fundamental failure of womanhood, a defect that rendered her useless in the most important role society had assigned to her gender. So Sarah had chosen silence and solitude over the humiliation of rejection and pity. She had thrown herself into teaching, pouring all her maternal instincts into caring for other people's children. It was a good life, she told herself, a useful life. It was enough. But on nights like this, when the loneliness crept in like fog off the mountains, Sarah wondered if she had made the right choice. She wondered what it would be like to have someone to talk to, someone who cared about her day, someone who would hold her when the weight of her secret became too much to bear alone. She thought about Jake Thompson's kind eyes and gentle words. For just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to have someone like him in her life. Then she firmly pushed the thought away. There was no point in such fantasies. Her path was set, and dreaming of alternatives would only bring more pain. Outside her window, Cedar Ridge settled into sleep. The saloon was still bustling with cowboys and railroad workers, but most of the respectable families had retired for the evening. Sarah finished grading the last of her papers and prepared for bed, steeling herself for another day of whispers, judgments, and the constant effort to appear content with a life that felt increasingly hollow. She didn't know that across town, in the bunkhouse at the Double Bar Ranch, Jake Thompson was lying awake thinking about the sad schoolteacher with the beautiful eyes. He had seen something in her face when that church woman had spoken so harshly, a kind of resigned pain that suggested she was carrying burdens far heavier than anyone knew. Jake had his own secrets, his own reasons for drifting from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to form lasting attachments. But something about Sarah Mitchell made him want to stay, to learn more about the woman behind the careful facade she presented to the world. Neither of them could have predicted how their lives were about to become intertwined, or how their meeting would ultimately challenge everything the town of Cedar Ridge believed about love, family, and what truly made a life worth living. The stage was set for a story that would unfold over the coming months, testing the strength of community bonds, the power of love to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and the courage required to live authentically in a world that demanded conformity above all else. As the moon rose over the Montana prairie, both Sarah and Jake faced restless nights, each sensing that their carefully ordered lives were about to change in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The books Jake had borrowed sat on his small table, waiting for morning light and the beginning of lessons that would teach him far more than just reading skills. In Cedar Ridge, change came slowly, like the gradual shift of seasons across the vast landscape. But when it finally arrived, it would transform everything, revealing truths that had long been hidden and forcing an entire community to confront its assumptions about what it truly meant to live a meaningful, loving life. 3 weeks had passed since Jake Thompson first visited the schoolhouse, and Sarah found herself looking forward to his regular appearances with an anticipation that both surprised and worried her. Every Tuesday and Friday evening, just after she finished preparing lessons for the next day, Jake would arrive with the books he had finished and select new ones for the coming week. Their conversations had gradually extended beyond simple book recommendations. Jake proved to be a thoughtful reader, asking questions that showed he was truly engaging with the material rather than simply reading words on a page. When he had finished the Civil War history, he spent 20 minutes discussing with Sarah the complex causes that had led to the conflict, showing an understanding that impressed her greatly. "You have a natural scholar's mind," Sarah had told him during one of these discussions. "Have you ever considered pursuing formal education?" Jake had laughed, but not unkindly. "Miss Mitchell, I'm 34 years old. I think my schooling days are long past. Besides, I can't afford to stop working to sit in a classroom." "Education doesn't always happen in a classroom," Sarah had replied. "Some of the wisest people I know taught themselves through reading and observation." These conversations were the brightest part of Sarah's increasingly difficult weeks. Mrs. Foster had made good on her threats, and Sarah found herself facing a growing campaign of whispered criticism and social isolation. The school board, influenced by the wives of its members, had begun questioning her methods and her influence on the children. Mrs. Patterson, whose husband served as the board's treasurer, had visited the school the previous Monday with a list of complaints. "We're concerned about the books you're assigning," she had said, looking disapprovingly at the classroom library. "Some of these seem quite advanced for rural children. Are you perhaps pushing them beyond their natural capabilities?" Sarah had clenched her fists behind her back. "I believe in challenging students to reach their full potential. The children have responded wonderfully to more challenging material." "But is that really appropriate?" Mrs. Patterson had continued. "These children will grow up to be farmers, ranchers, and their wives. Do they really need to read about ancient Greece or advanced mathematics? Shouldn't we focus on practical skills?" The implication was clear. Sarah's own unmarried status made her unqualified to prepare children for their proper roles in life. As a spinster with no domestic experience, what could she possibly teach young girls about becoming wives and mothers? The criticism was taking its toll. Sarah found herself second-guessing every decision, every lesson plan, every interaction with her students. The joy she had always found in teaching was being slowly strangled by the constant scrutiny and disapproval. On this particular Friday evening, Jake arrived to find Sarah sitting at her desk, staring blankly at a letter that had arrived that afternoon. She looked up when he entered, and he was struck by how tired and sad she appeared. "Evening, Miss Mitchell," he said gently. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Sarah replied, hastily folding the letter and sliding it into her desk drawer. "How did you find the Mark Twain stories?" They were wonderful, Jake said, setting the book on her desk. That Tom Sawyer is quite a character. Reminded me a bit of myself at that age, though I never had quite as much imagination for mischief. Sarah managed a small smile. I can picture you as an adventurous boy. Did you grow up in Montana? Colorado, actually. My family had a small ranch near Colorado Springs. Jake's expression grew thoughtful. Lost it after Pa died. Ma couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments even with me working. We had to sell and move in with my aunt in Denver. I'm sorry, Sarah said softly. That must have been very difficult. It was what it was, Jake replied with a shrug. Life doesn't always go according to plan, but it taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by how he treats others and what he does with the opportunities he gets. Sarah looked at him with new understanding. Is that why you moved from ranch to ranch? You mentioned you'd worked in several states. Jake was quiet for a moment, studying her face. There was something about this woman that invited honesty, a quality of genuine interest without judgment that he rarely encountered. Partly, he admitted, I've never been one to put down roots easily, but also, well, let's just say I've learned it's sometimes better to keep moving than to let people get too close. The sadness in his voice resonated with something deep in Sarah's own heart. She recognized the sound of someone who had been hurt, someone who had built walls to protect themselves from further pain. That sounds lonely, she said quietly. Sometimes, Jake acknowledged. But it's safe, can't disappoint people if they don't expect anything from you. Sarah was about to respond when they were interrupted by a sharp knock on the schoolhouse door. Both of them turned in surprise as the door opened without invitation, revealing Mrs. Foster and two other church ladies, Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Wallace. The three women entered the classroom with the air of a tribunal arriving to pass judgment. Mrs. Foster's eyes immediately fixed on Jake, then moved to Sarah with obvious disapproval. Miss Mitchell, Mrs. Foster said in her most authoritative tone, we need to discuss some serious concerns that have been brought to our attention. Sarah stood slowly, her heart sinking. Mrs. Foster, perhaps this conversation would be better scheduled for a more appropriate time. On the contrary, Mrs. Foster replied, I think this is exactly the right time. We've been hearing disturbing reports about your private meetings with men of questionable character. Jake's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, watching the exchange with growing concern for Sarah. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward. It's highly inappropriate for an unmarried woman to be meeting alone with strange men, especially in a place dedicated to the education of innocent children. Mr. Thompson comes here to borrow books, Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady. He's improving his education. I fail to see how that's inappropriate. Mrs. Wallace, who had been silent until now, spoke up with false sweetness. Dear, we know you mean well, but a woman in your position must be especially careful about appearances. People are beginning to talk. What are they saying? Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Well, Mrs. Foster said with obvious relish, some are suggesting that your friendship with this cowboy might explain why you've never married. Perhaps you prefer the company of rough men to respectable suitors. The implication hung in the air like a physical blow. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with humiliation and anger. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but Jake spoke first. Ma'am, he said quietly, addressing Mrs. Foster directly, I think you're out of line. Miss Mitchell has shown me nothing but kindness and respect. She's helping me improve myself through education, which I would think any Christian woman would support. Mrs. Foster turned on him with venom. How dare you address me? This is a matter for respectable people to discuss, not saddle tramps and drifters. Mrs. Foster, Sarah said sharply, that is quite enough. Mr. Thompson is a guest in this school, and I will not tolerate you speaking to him so rudely. You see, Mrs. Henderson said triumphantly, she defends him against respectable members of the community. It's exactly what we feared. Mrs. Wallace nodded sagely. Sarah, dear, we're only trying to help you understand how this looks. A spinster woman, past her prime, suddenly taking such an interest in a young cowboy. People naturally wonder about your motivations. The word spinster cut through Sarah like a knife, just as it always did. But this time, something inside her snapped. Years of enduring such treatment, of accepting the community's judgment and pity, suddenly seemed unbearable. My motivations, Sarah said with quiet dignity, are to help another human being improve his education and his circumstances. If that seems suspicious to you, perhaps you should examine your own hearts and ask why kindness appears so foreign to you." Mrs. Foster gasped. "How dare you? We are pillars of this community, good Christian women who are trying to protect the moral fabric of our town." "By attacking a man for wanting to read books?" Sarah asked. "By condemning me for helping him? What exactly about that threatens your moral fabric?" Jake stepped forward. "Ladies, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I have the deepest respect for Miss Mitchell, and I would never do anything to compromise her reputation. If my presence here is causing problems, I'll find another way to get books." "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said firmly, "you will do no such thing. These ladies have no authority over this school or over my actions as a teacher. You are welcome here any time." Mrs. Foster's face was red with anger. "This is exactly the kind of defiant attitude we've been talking about. You seem to think the rules that govern decent women don't apply to you." "What rules?" Sarah demanded. "The rules that say I must apologize for my unmarried state. The rules that say I cannot show basic human kindness without it being seen as scandalous. The rules that make me less than a person because I don't have a husband." The three women exchanged glances. Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat. "Sarah, we understand that your situation is difficult, but surely you can see that fraternizing with cowboys is hardly the solution." "What situation?" Sarah asked dangerously. Mrs. Wallace looked uncomfortable. "Well, your failure to attract a suitable husband. Your inability to fulfill a woman's natural role. We sympathize, truly, but that doesn't excuse inappropriate behavior." Something died in Sarah's eyes at those words. Jake saw it happen, saw the moment when the last of her hope seemed to crumble. He had heard enough. "Ladies," he said, his voice carefully controlled but with an edge of steel beneath it, "I think you've said quite enough. Miss Mitchell is one of the finest people I've ever met, and if this community can't see that, it says nothing about her and everything about you." Mrs. Foster whirled on him. "You insolent man, who do you think you are to judge us?" "I'm nobody special," Jake replied calmly. "Just a cowboy who was raised to treat people with respect, something it seems you ladies never learned." The confrontation was interrupted by another knock on the door. This time it was Mr. Peterson, whose youngest daughter was in Sarah's class. He looked uncomfortable as he entered and saw the gathering. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, "but I was hopping to speak with Miss Mitchell about Emma's progress. She's been so excited about the poetry unit you've been teaching." Mrs. Foster saw her opportunity. "Mr. Peterson, perhaps you should be aware of some concerns the community has about Miss Mitchell's behavior. We were just discussing her inappropriate meetings with strange men." Mr. Peterson looked confused. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. What meetings?" "She's been entertaining this cowboy," Mrs. Henderson said, gesturing toward Jake, "in private after school hours. It's highly irregular." Mr. Peterson's face cleared. "Oh, you mean the reading program? Yes, Emma mentioned that. She thinks it's wonderful that Miss Mitchell is helping someone learn to read better. She wants to be a teacher herself someday, and she says Miss Mitchell tells them that education is for everyone." The three church ladies looked deflated. Mr. Peterson continued, "I have to say, I think it speaks very well of Miss Mitchell's character that she would take time to help someone improve themselves. We could use more of that spirit in this community." After the brief encounter ended, and Mr. Peterson left with glowing reports about his daughter's progress, the three women found their position considerably weakened. Mrs. Foster made one last attempt to regain control of the situation. "This isn't over, Miss Mitchell. The school board will hear about all of this. Your behavior is setting a poor example for impressionable children." "Then I suggest you tell them the truth," Sarah replied. "Tell them I'm helping someone learn to read. Tell them I'm treating another human being with dignity and respect. If the school board finds that objectionable, then perhaps this isn't the right community for me after all." After the women left, the schoolhouse fell silent. Sarah sank into her chair, emotionally drained by the confrontation. Jake remained standing, his face troubled. "Miss Mitchell," he said gently, "I'm sorry. I never meant for my coming here to cause you problems." "You didn't cause anything," Sarah replied wearily. "This has been building for years. You just gave them a convenient excuse to voice what they've always thought about me." Jake moved closer to her desk. "What they said about you was cruel and wrong. You know that, don't you?" Sarah looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Do I? Sometimes I wonder if they're right, If there is something fundamentally wrong with me, something that makes me unfit for a normal life. There is absolutely nothing wrong with you, Jake said firmly. You're kind, intelligent, dedicated to your students, and brave enough to stand up for what you believe in. Any man would be lucky to have you in his life. The sincerity in his voice brought tears to Sarah's eyes. You don't understand, Jake. It's not that simple. There are things about me. Reasons why I can never have the life they expect all women to want. Jake was quiet for a moment, studying her face. We all have our secrets, Sarah, things we can't or won't share, but that doesn't make us broken. The use of her first name felt shockingly intimate in the quiet classroom. Sarah realized this was the first time in years that a man had spoken to her with such gentle understanding. What secrets could you possibly have? She asked softly. Jake's expression grew distant. I told you my father died when I was 12. What I didn't tell you was how. He was killed trying to stop a lynching. 3 men were going to hang a Mexican ranch hand for a crime he didn't commit. My father tried to intervene, and they killed him too. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Jake continued, his voice steady but filled with old pain. My mother never got over it. She blamed my father for getting involved, for putting principle above his family's safety. She spent the rest of her life bitter and angry, convinced that doing the right thing was a luxury we couldn't afford. That's terrible, Sarah whispered, but it doesn't explain why you keep moving, why you won't let people get close. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I was engaged once, to a wonderful woman named Rebecca. She was beautiful, kind, everything a man could want in a wife. But when I told her about my father, about how he died, she couldn't accept it. She said she needed a man who would put his family first, who wouldn't risk everything for strangers. Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. She broke the engagement. She said she couldn't trust me not to follow in my father's footsteps, that I would always choose principle over pragmatism, and she couldn't live with that uncertainty. Jake's smile was sad. She married a banker 6 months later, a safe, predictable man who would never risk everything for his convictions. Sarah felt a deep ache in her chest, recognizing the pain of rejection and misunderstanding. I'm so sorry, Jake. She was wrong to ask you to change who you are. Was she? Jake asked. Maybe she was being practical. Maybe some people are just too damaged for normal happiness. Don't say that, Sarah said fiercely. Your father was a hero. He died trying to prevent an injustice. That's something to be proud of, not ashamed of. Jake looked at her with surprise. Most people don't see it that way. They think he was a fool who threw his life away. Then most people are wrong, Sarah declared. Your father was a man of principle who couldn't stand by and watch innocent people suffer. The world needs more men like that, not fewer. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing the confessions they had shared. Sarah felt a strange sense of relief at finally hearing someone else's story of rejection and loss. She wasn't alone in carrying secret pain. Thank you, Jake said finally, for understanding, for not judging. Thank you for the same, Sarah replied. And Jake, don't let those women drive you away. If you want to keep borrowing books, keep coming. I won't let their narrow minds dictate my choices anymore. Jake smiled, and for the first time since he had arrived in Cedar Ridge, he felt like he might have found a place where he could belong, at least temporarily. In that case, he said, I'd like to try something more challenging next week. Do you have any philosophy? I've always been curious about the great thinkers. Sarah's face lit up with the first genuine smile she had worn in days. I have just the thing, Emerson's essays. I think you'll find them particularly relevant to your own experiences and beliefs. As Jake prepared to leave that evening, he paused at the door. Sarah, he said quietly, whatever secrets you think make you unmarriageable, whatever reasons you think you can't have a normal life, I want you to know something. You're not broken. You're not less than anyone else in this town. In fact, you're better than most of them. After he left, Sarah sat alone in the darkening classroom, thinking about their conversation. For the first time in years, she didn't feel quite so alone with her burdens. Jake had trusted her with his pain, and somehow that made her own seem more bearable. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, dusting the streets of Cedar Ridge with a clean white coating that would temporarily hide the town's flaws and make everything look pure and new. Sarah watched the snowflakes drift past the schoolhouse windows and allowed herself to hope that perhaps new beginnings were possible, even for someone like her. She didn't know that across town, Jake was having similar thoughts as he settled into his bunk at the Double Bar Ranch. For the first time in years, he was questioning his policy of never staying in one place too long. There was something about Sarah Mitchell that made him want to put down roots, to fight for something worth having rather than always running from the possibility of loss. The seeds of something deeper than friendship had been planted that evening, though neither of them was ready to acknowledge it yet. In the meantime, they would continue their careful dance of shared books and growing understanding, each finding in the other a kindred spirit who had learned to carry pain with dignity and grace. The first major snowstorm of winter hit Cedar Ridge in early December, blanketing the town in 3 feet of pristine white snow that made travel difficult and forced the close-knit community to depend on each other in ways that temporarily set aside some of their petty differences. The schoolhouse was closed for 3 days while the roads were cleared, giving Sarah an unexpected break from her daily routine. During those quiet days, she found herself thinking constantly about Jake Thompson. Their conversations had become the highlight of her weeks, and his absence felt more profound than it should have. She told herself it was simply because she enjoyed having someone to discuss books with, someone who challenged her intellectually and listened to her thoughts without judgment. But if she was honest with herself, which she tried to be in the privacy of her small apartment, she had to admit that her feelings had grown beyond simple friendship. Jake's kindness, his thoughtful questions, and his gentle way of seeing the world had awakened something in her that she had thought permanently buried. For the first time in years, she found herself wondering what it would be like to have someone who truly understood her, someone who saw her as a whole person rather than a collection of failures and disappointments. The thought terrified her. She had built her life around the certainty that marriage and family were impossible for her. To allow herself to hope for something different felt like inviting heartbreak on a scale she might not survive. When school resumed on Thursday, Sarah threw herself into preparing for the Christmas pageant, an annual tradition that involved all the children and required weeks of preparation. It was a welcome distraction from her confused emotions and the ongoing tension with the church ladies, who had indeed followed through on their threats to complain to the school board. Mr. Harrison, the board chairman, had visited her the previous week for what he called a friendly chat about her teaching methods and personal conduct. He was a fair man, generally supportive of her work, but the pressure from the wives was clearly taking its toll. "Sarah," he had said, using her first name in the familiar way of someone who had known her for years, "I want you to know that I think you're doing excellent work with the children. Their test scores are the best in the county, and the parents are generally very pleased." The word "generally" hung between them like a warning. "However," Mr. Harrison continued, "there have been some concerns raised about propriety. I'm not saying I agree with these concerns, but I have to take them seriously." Sarah had listened with growing dread as he outlined the complaints. Her unmarried status setting a poor example for young girls, her inappropriate friendship with Jake Thompson, her defiant attitude toward community standards. "What do you want me to do?" Sarah had asked quietly. "I can't change my marital status, and I won't apologize for treating Mr. Thompson with basic human decency." Mr. Harrison had looked uncomfortable. "I'm not asking you to apologize for anything, but perhaps it would be wise to be more circumspect in your interactions. Maybe arrange for someone else to be present when he comes to borrow books, or suggest he visit the public library instead." The suggestion had felt like a betrayal, though Sarah knew Mr. Harrison meant well. The public library consisted of 3 shelves in the corner of the general store, stocked primarily with outdated almanacs and romance novels. It was hardly suitable for someone of Jake's intelligence and curiosity. "I'll consider your suggestions," Sarah had said diplomatically, though she had no intention of following them. Now, as she prepared decorations for the Christmas pageant, Sarah wondered how much longer she could continue to fight these battles. The weight of constant scrutiny and disapproval was exhausting, and she sometimes wondered if it might be easier to simply leave Cedar Ridge and start over somewhere else. Her thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock on the classroom door. She looked up to see Jake standing in the doorway, snowflakes still melting on his coat shoulders. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "I know it's not my usual day, but I finished the Emerson essays and wanted to discuss them while they were still fresh in my mind." Sarah's heart lifted at the sight of him. "Of course, come in. I was just working on decorations for the Christmas pageant. How did you find Emerson?" Jake stepped into the warm classroom, stamping the snow off his boots. Remarkable. I've never read anything like it. His ideas about self-reliance and nonconformity really struck a chord with me. As they settled into their usual spots, Jake in one of the student chairs, Sarah perched on the edge of her desk, their conversation quickly deepened beyond simple book discussion. "There was one passage that particularly spoke to me," Jake said, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. Sarah was touched to see that he had been taking notes. He wrote, "To be great is to be misunderstood." I've been thinking about that a lot. "In what way?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Jake was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I've spent most of my adult life trying to fit in, to be the kind of man people expected me to be. After Rebecca broke our engagement, I convinced myself that my father's idealism was a luxury I couldn't afford. I tried to become more practical, more acceptable." "And did it work?" Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Not at all. I just became miserable. Turns out you can't really change who you are at your core, no matter how much you want to." Sarah felt a stab of recognition. "I understand that feeling. I've spent years trying to be what this community wants me to be, grateful for my position, apologetic for my unmarried state, careful never to step out of line. But it never seems to be enough." "Maybe that's because we're trying to squeeze ourselves into shapes that were never meant to fit us," Jake suggested. "Emerson argues that we should trust our own instincts, even if they go against conventional wisdom." "That's a dangerous philosophy in a place like Cedar Ridge," Sarah said wryly. "Is it, or is it the only way to live authentically?" Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of children's voices outside. Sarah glanced at the clock and realized it was later than she had thought. The older students often stayed after school to help with preparations for various events. "Miss Mitchell," Emma Walsh appeared in the doorway, followed by several other children. "Oh, sorry, we didn't know you had company." "It's all right, Emma. Mr. Thompson was just returning some books. What can I help you with?" "We were wondering if we could practice the Christmas songs one more time before tomorrow's rehearsal," Emma said hopefully. "And Tommy wanted to ask you about his lines for the pageant." Sarah looked at Jake apologetically, but he smiled and stood up. "I should be going anyway. Thank you for the book recommendation, Miss Mitchell." As he prepared to leave, young Tommy Rodriguez stepped forward shyly. "Mr. Thompson, are you the one who's been reading Miss Mitchell's books?" Jake looked surprised but nodded. "That's right. Miss Mitchell has been kind enough to help me improve my reading." Tommy's face lit up. "That's wonderful. My papa says reading is very important, but he doesn't have time to teach me better. Maybe when you're done learning, you could teach me." The simple request from the child seemed to affect Jake deeply. "I'd be honored to help you, Tommy, though I'm still learning myself." "Miss Mitchell says the best way to learn is to teach others," Emma chimed in. "She says when we explain things to someone else, we understand them better ourselves." Jake glanced at Sarah with something like wonder in his eyes. "She sounds very wise." "She's the best teacher in the whole world," declared little Mary Peterson. "She makes everything interesting, even arithmetic." As the children continued to chatter about their teacher's virtues, Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. These children didn't see her as a failed woman or a disappointing spinster. They simply saw someone who cared about them and believed in their potential. After Jake left and the children had finished their practice, Sarah remained in the classroom longer than usual, thinking about their conversation. Emerson's philosophy of self-reliance was appealing in theory, but putting it into practice seemed almost impossibly difficult, especially for a woman in her position. The next evening brought the Christmas pageant rehearsal, and with it, most of the town's families crowded into the schoolhouse to watch their children perform. Sarah had worked hard to create something special, incorporating music, poetry, and short dramatic scenes that showcased each child's unique talents. Jake arrived just as the rehearsal was beginning, slipping quietly into the back of the room. Sarah was surprised to see him, but pleased that he had come. She noticed several of the town women whispering among themselves when they spotted him, but she forced herself to focus on the children's performance. The rehearsal went beautifully. Tommy Rodriguez, despite his struggles with reading, delivered his lines as one of the wise men with confidence and dignity. Emma Walsh sang a solo that brought tears to several parents' eyes. Even the youngest children, who sometimes became overwhelmed by performing in front of adults, rose to the occasion with enthusiasm. When it was over, the parents gathered around to congratulate Sarah on her work. For a brief, shining moment, the usual tension seemed forgotten as the community came together to celebrate their children's achievements. "Miss Mitchell," said Mrs. Rodriguez, Tommy's mother, "this was magnificent. Tommy has been practicing his lines for weeks. He's so proud to be part of this." Mr. Walsh, Emma's father, nodded in agreement. "Emma talks about the pageant constantly. She says you've made her feel like she can do anything." Even some of the more critical parents seemed impressed. Mrs. Patterson, who had complained about Sarah's teaching methods just weeks earlier, grudgingly admitted that the children had clearly worked very hard and performed admirably. As the families began to leave, Jake approached the front of the room where Sarah was cleaning up. "That was incredible," he said sincerely. "Those children adore you, and it shows. You've given them something precious, confidence in themselves." "Thank you," Sarah replied, feeling a rush of pride and accomplishment. "They worked very hard. They deserve to shine." "You all deserve to shine," Jake corrected gently. "What you've created here is special, Sarah. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." They were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Foster, who had apparently been waiting for the crowd to thin before approaching. Her expression was less hostile than usual, but still far from friendly. "Miss Mitchell," she said formally, "I must admit the children performed admirably this evening. However, I feel I must address the impropriety of your guests' presence at a school function." Jake started to speak, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. She was tired of defending herself, tired of tiptoeing around the sensibilities of people who seemed determined to find fault with everything she did. "Mrs. Foster," Sarah said calmly, "Mr. Thompson attended a public school event just as any other community member might. I fail to see what's improper about that." "He's not a community member," Mrs. Foster protested. "He's a drifter, a cowboy with no ties to this town. His presence at children's events is inappropriate and sends the wrong message." "What message is that?" Sarah asked. Mrs. Foster looked flustered. "Well, it suggests that you consider him important to you, that you welcome his attention in ways that are unseemly for an unmarried woman." Jake had heard enough. "Ma'am, with all due respect, your concern seems to be based on assumptions rather than facts. I attended this event because I wanted to see the children perform and because I have great respect for Miss Mitchell's work as an educator. Nothing more, nothing less." "You see," Mrs. Foster said triumphantly, "he speaks to me as if we were equals, as if his opinion carries the same weight as that of respectable community members." "In my opinion," Jake replied quietly, "a person's worth isn't determined by their social position or how long they've lived in a particular place. It's determined by their actions and their character." Mrs. Foster's face flushed with anger. "How dare you presume to lecture me about character? You, who has no ties, no responsibilities, no standing in this community." "Perhaps that gives me a clearer perspective," Jake suggested. "I can see this place and its people without the bias of old grudges and social expectations." "And what exactly do you see?" Mrs. Foster demanded. Jake glanced at Sarah, then back at Mrs. Foster. "I see a community blessed with an exceptional teacher who cares deeply about every child in her classroom. I see children who are thriving under her guidance, learning not just academics but confidence and creativity. And I see adults who seem determined to tear down something beautiful because it doesn't conform to their narrow expectations." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Mrs. Foster's face went through several shades of red before settling on a deep purple. "Mr. Thompson," she said icily, "you are clearly not the kind of man this community needs. I suggest you consider moving on before you cause any more disruption." "That's not your decision to make," Sarah said firmly. "Mr. Thompson has every right to be here, and I won't stand by and watch you try to drive away a good man simply because he doesn't fit your definition of acceptable." Mrs. Foster turned on Sarah with renewed venom. "Your defense of this man proves exactly what we've suspected all along. You've developed inappropriate feelings for him, and it's clouding your judgment. A proper woman would never behave as you're behaving." "And how exactly am I behaving?" Sarah asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Like a desperate spinster, throwing herself at the first man who shows her any attention," Mrs. Foster said cruelly. The words hit Sarah like physical blows, confirming her worst fears about how the community saw her. But instead of the shame and humiliation she expected to feel, A different emotion rose up inside her, pure, blazing anger. "Mrs. Foster," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fire in her eyes, "I have spent years accepting your judgment and the judgment of others like you. I have allowed you to make me feel ashamed of who I am, apologetic for my life choices, and grateful for scraps of acceptance. But no more." Mrs. Foster stepped back, clearly surprised by Sarah's sudden assertiveness. "You want to know why I'm not married," Sarah continued. "You want to understand why I don't have children of my own. It's not because I'm desperate or defective or unnaturally devoted to my career. It's because I refuse to settle for a life that requires me to diminish myself to make others comfortable." Jake watched in amazement as Sarah finally stood up for herself with a strength and dignity that took his breath away. "I am a good teacher," Sarah declared. "I am a kind person. I contribute meaningfully to this community. And if that's not enough for you, if you need me to be something I'm not in order to earn your approval, then your approval isn't worth having." Mrs. Foster opened and closed her mouth several times, clearly unprepared for this level of resistance. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, "my friendship with Mr. Thompson is based on mutual respect and shared interests. If you find that threatening or improper, perhaps you should examine why the idea of a man and woman relating to each other as intellectual equals seems so foreign to you." With that, Sarah began gathering her things, signaling that the conversation was over. Mrs. Foster, deflated and confused by this unexpected turn of events, retreated without another word. When they were alone, Jake looked at Sarah with something approaching awe. "That was magnificent," he said softly. "I've never seen anyone stand up to her like that." Sarah was shaking slightly, the adrenaline from the confrontation still coursing through her veins. "I don't know what came over me. I've never spoken to anyone like that before." "You spoke the truth," Jake said simply. "And you did it with grace and dignity, even when she was being deliberately cruel." Sarah sank into her chair, suddenly exhausted. "I may have just ended my teaching career. The school board won't tolerate that kind of defiance." "Maybe," Jake said. "Or maybe it's time this community learned what they'll lose if they drive away the best teacher they've ever had." As they prepared to leave the schoolhouse that evening, neither of them could have predicted how Mrs. Foster would choose to retaliate against Sarah's public defiance, or how their growing friendship would soon be tested by challenges that would force them both to decide what they were willing to risk for the chance at real happiness. The battle lines had been drawn, and the real test of their courage was yet to come. Mrs. Foster's revenge came swiftly and with a cruelty that surprised even Sarah, who had grown accustomed to the woman's vindictive nature. 3 days after the confrontation at the Christmas pageant rehearsal, a letter arrived at the school board chairman's office that would change everything. Sarah knew nothing of this letter when she arrived at school that Friday morning to find Mr. Harrison waiting for her with a grim expression and an official-looking document in his hands. 2 other board members, Mr. Patterson and Mr. Walsh, stood beside him, their faces troubled. "Sarah," Mr. Harrison said without preamble, "we need to talk. There have been some serious allegations made against you, and we're required to investigate them." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What kind of allegations?" Mr. Harrison looked deeply uncomfortable. "Mrs. Foster has submitted a formal complaint alleging improper conduct. She claims to have witnessed intimate behavior between you and Mr. Thompson." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "That's completely untrue. Mrs. Foster has never witnessed anything inappropriate because nothing inappropriate has occurred. She states that she saw you and Mr. Thompson in what she describes as a compromising embrace after hours in the schoolhouse," Mr. Patterson said, reading from the letter. "She claims this is part of a pattern of immoral behavior that makes you unfit to teach children." Sarah felt the world spinning around her. "She's lying. Mr. Thompson and I have never even touched, let alone embraced. Our relationship is strictly professional and appropriate." Mr. Walsh, Emma's father, looked torn between his respect for Sarah and his obligation to take the allegations seriously. "Sarah, we've known you for years, and this doesn't sound like you. But Mrs. Foster is a respected member of the community, and she's provided what she claims are specific dates and times." "Then let her prove it," Sarah said desperately. "Let her bring witnesses. Let her provide evidence beyond her word." Mr. Harrison shook his head sadly. "She claims the incidents occurred when you thought no one was watching, And unfortunately, the mere allegation is enough to create a scandal that could damage the school's reputation. "So you're going to dismiss me based on lies?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're not dismissing you," Mr. Harrison said quickly. "But we are placing you on temporary suspension pending a full investigation. You'll continue to receive your salary, but you cannot teach until this matter is resolved." Sarah sank into her chair, the implications washing over her. In a community like Cedar Ridge, even being suspended for such allegations would be enough to destroy her reputation permanently. Whether the charges were proven or not, she would forever be the teacher who had been accused of improper conduct. "How long will this investigation take?" she asked numbly. Mr. Patterson consulted the documents. "We'll need to interview witnesses, review the circumstances, and make a formal determination. Probably several weeks, possibly longer." "And what happens to my students in the meantime?" "We're arranging for a substitute teacher from Helena," Mr. Harrison said. "Mrs. Foster has recommended a young woman from her church who recently completed her teaching certification." The final insult. Not only was Mrs. Foster destroying Sarah's career, but she was positioning her own candidate to take over the classroom Sarah had worked so hard to build. After the board members left, Sarah remained alone in the schoolhouse she might never see again as a teacher. The Christmas decorations the children had helped her create seemed to mock her now, symbols of joy and hope in a situation that felt hopeless. She was still sitting there an hour later when Jake arrived for what she realized might be their last book discussion. One look at her face told him something terrible had happened. "Sarah, what's wrong?" Through tears she couldn't hold back any longer, Sarah told him about the allegations and her suspension. Jake listened with growing anger, his jaw tightening with each detail. "She's lying," he said flatly when Sarah finished, "and everyone who knows you should realize that." "But they don't," Sarah said miserably. "Or they can't afford to take that risk. Even if they believe I'm innocent, the scandal alone is enough to make me unemployable." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his mind working. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you weeks ago." Sarah looked up at him through her tears, surprised by the serious tone in his voice. "I'm not just a cowboy drifting from ranch to ranch," Jake said slowly. "I have money, a considerable amount actually. I've been living simply by choice, not necessity." Sarah stared at him in confusion. "I don't understand." Jake took a deep breath. "After my father was killed, my mother sold our ranch. But she didn't sell it to just anyone. She sold it to a man who turned out to be sitting on one of the largest silver deposits in Colorado. He made a fortune from our land and always felt guilty about it. When I turned 25, he tracked me down and gave me a share of the profits. A very generous share." "You're wealthy?" Sarah asked, still trying to process this information. "Moderately, yes. I could buy a ranch, start a business, live comfortably anywhere I chose. But I kept moving because I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, how I wanted to use the opportunity I'd been given." Sarah felt a new kind of hurt washing over her. "Why didn't you tell me? Have you been amusing yourself by playing the poor cowboy improving his education?" "No," Jake said firmly. "That part is completely genuine. I do want to improve myself, and our conversations have been the most meaningful I've ever had. I didn't tell you about the money because I wanted someone to care about me for who I am, not what I have." Sarah understood that feeling all too well, but she was still reeling from the revelation. "What does this have to do with my current situation?" Jake moved closer to her desk. "It means I can help you. I can fight Mrs. Foster's lies. I can hire investigators, lawyers if necessary. I can prove that her allegations are false." "And how would you do that without making everything worse?" Sarah asked bitterly. "Your involvement in defending me would only confirm everyone's suspicions about our relationship." "Then maybe it's time to give them something real to suspect," Jake said quietly. Sarah's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" Jake knelt beside her chair, looking into her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Marry me, Sarah." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Sarah stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I know it seems sudden," Jake continued, "but it's not really. I've been falling in love with you since that first day in the classroom. Your kindness, your intelligence, your strength, everything about you draws me to you." "Jake, you don't understand," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. I can't marry you, I can't marry anyone. Why not? Sarah closed her eyes, knowing that this moment would either save her or destroy the last hope she had for happiness. Because I can't have children. I'm barren, Jake. No man wants a wife who can't give him a family. She waited for the withdrawal, the polite excuses, the gentle rejection she had imagined so many times. Instead, Jake reached out and gently took her hands in his. Is that what you think? He asked softly. That a man could only love you for your ability to bear children? Sarah opened her eyes, surprised by the tenderness in his voice. It's what every man wants, a family, children to carry on his name. Jake shook his head. Sarah, I fell in love with your mind, your heart, your soul. Yes, I think you would be a wonderful mother, and yes, children would be a blessing. But they wouldn't be the reason for our marriage or the measure of its success. But the community expects. The community expects a lot of things that don't make sense, Jake interrupted. They expect women to be grateful for any husband they can get, regardless of how they're treated. They expect men to measure their worth by how many sons they can sire. They expect everyone to conform to a narrow definition of happiness that leaves no room for individual circumstances or preferences. Sarah was crying harder now, years of suppressed pain and loneliness pouring out of her. You don't know what you're saying. When you really think about it, when you imagine the future, you'll realize that a wife who can't give you children isn't enough. Jake stood and pulled Sarah gently to her feet, then took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. Listen to me carefully, Sarah Mitchell. You are not less than any other woman because you can't bear children. You are not a consolation prize or a compromise. You are an extraordinary woman who has devoted her life to nurturing and educating other people's children with a love and dedication that most biological mothers never achieve. Jake, I'm not finished, he said firmly. Do you want to know what I see when I look at you? I see the woman who stayed after school every day last month to help Tommy Rodriguez learn to read. I see the teacher who spent her own money to buy warm clothes for the Peterson children when their father was out of work. I see someone who has touched dozens of young lives and made them better, richer, more full of possibility. Sarah was sobbing now, overwhelmed by hearing herself described with such love and admiration. Jake continued, his voice gentle but unwavering. If we marry, we'll have each other, and that will be enough. If we want children in our lives, there are orphanages full of children who need homes and love. We could adopt, or simply continue to make a difference in the lives of children through teaching and community involvement. You really mean that? Sarah whispered. I've never meant anything more in my life, Jake replied. Marry me, Sarah, not to escape Mrs. Foster's lies, not to conform to social expectations, but because I love you and I believe you love me too. Sarah looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity, love, and hope. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that she might be worthy of such devotion. I do love you, she whispered. I've been trying not to, but I do. I love your kindness, your curiosity, your strength. I love the way you see the world and the way you make me feel when you look at me. Jake's face lit up with joy. Is that a yes? It's a yes, Sarah said, smiling through her tears. But you should know what you're taking on. This scandal will follow us wherever we go. Your reputation will be damaged by association with mine. Then we'll build new reputations, Jake said firmly. Together, and we'll do it in a place where people will judge us by our actions, not our past. As Jake kissed her for the first time, gentle and sweet in the schoolroom where their love had grown, Sarah felt a sense of peace she had never experienced before. For the first time in her adult life, she was exactly where she belonged, with someone who loved her not despite her perceived flaws, but because of the whole person she was. Outside, snow was falling again on Cedar Ridge, and the town that had tried so hard to break Sarah's spirit was about to learn that some kinds of love are stronger than prejudice, gossip, or narrow-minded expectations. But their story was far from over. Mrs. Foster's lies would need to be addressed, the school board's investigation would have to be resolved, and Sarah and Jake would need to decide whether their future lay in Cedar Ridge or somewhere far away from the people who had tried so hard to keep them apart. What they didn't know was that help was coming from an unexpected source, and that the truth about Mrs. Foster's motivations was about to emerge in a way that would shock everyone who thought they knew the real story behind the accusations. The battle for their happiness had only just begun, but for the first time, Sarah felt strong enough to fight for what she wanted instead of simply accepting what others thought she deserved. The news of Sarah and Jake's engagement spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire, creating a buzz of gossip that ranged from shocked disapproval to genuine happiness for the couple. While Mrs. Foster and her circle saw it as confirmation of their worst suspicions, many others viewed it as a romantic development that explained the obvious affection between the schoolteacher and the thoughtful cowboy. What no one expected was the quiet revolution that began 3 days after Jake's proposal, when Mrs. Elena Rodriguez knocked on Sarah's apartment door with a determined expression and a worn envelope in her hands. "Miss Mitchell," she said in her careful English, "I must speak with you about Mrs. Foster's lies." Sarah, who had been packing her belongings while contemplating a move to another town, invited Mrs. Rodriguez inside with curiosity and hope. Tommy's mother was known throughout Cedar Ridge as a woman of unshakable integrity who rarely involved herself in community politics. "Mrs. Rodriguez, please sit down. Can I offer you some tea?" Elena shook her head, too agitated for social pleasantries. "Miss Mitchell, what Mrs. Foster says about you and Senor Thompson, it is not true. I know this because I was there." Sarah's heart began to race. "You were where?" "At the schoolhouse the night she claims to have seen you in this embrace." Elena's face flushed with embarrassment at having to discuss such matters. "I came to get Tommy's arithmetic book that he forgot. Mrs. Foster, she was hiding behind the building, watching through the window." Sarah sank into her chair, hardly daring to hope. "What did you see?" Elena pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket. "I write everything down because I know Mrs. Foster will make trouble. You and Senor Thompson, you were sitting at your desk talking about books. He was in a student chair, very proper distance. You showed him something in a book, pointing at the page. Nothing more, nothing improper." "And Mrs. Foster saw this too?" She saw the same thing, but when she left I heard her talking to herself, saying she would fix that woman once and for all and teach her what happens when you don't know your place." Elena's eyes flashed with anger. She planned to lie about what she saw. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and renewed outrage. "Would you be willing to tell this to the school board?" Elena nodded firmly. "I will tell them, but there is more. Mrs. Foster, she has done this before." Sarah leaned forward, intrigued despite her emotional exhaustion. 5 years ago, there was another teacher, Miss Catherine Wells. She was young, very pretty, and she made friends with the banker's son. Mrs. Foster started rumors about them too, said she saw improper behavior. Miss Wells, she left town in disgrace. But my friend Maria, she worked as a maid for Mrs. Foster then. She heard Mrs. Foster planning the whole thing with Mrs. Henderson. The picture that emerged was of a systematic campaign to control who could teach in Cedar Ridge, ensuring that only women who met Mrs. Foster's narrow standards could influence the town's children. "Why hasn't anyone spoken up before?" Sarah asked. Elena looked down at her hands. "Mrs. Foster, she has much power. Her husband is deacon. She controls the church ladies. People are afraid, but what she does to you, it is too much. You are good teacher, good woman. My Tommy, he loves you like a mother. I will not let her destroy you with lies." As word of Elena's willingness to testify spread quietly through the Hispanic community, other voices began to emerge. Maria Santos, the former maid, agreed to speak about what she had overheard. Carlos Mendez, who worked maintenance at the church, admitted he had seen Mrs. Foster lurking around the schoolhouse on several occasions, taking notes and watching Sarah's interactions with visitors. But the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Foster's own daughter, Rebecca, who had moved back to Cedar Ridge after her divorce and had been staying with her mother. Rebecca sought out Sarah privately, arriving at her apartment on a snowy Thursday evening with red-rimmed eyes and a conscience she could no longer ignore. "Miss Mitchell," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something about my mother's accusations. They're not just lies, they're part of a larger pattern that I can't stay silent about anymore." Sarah invited her in, noting how much the younger woman resembled her mother in appearance, but seemed to possess a gentleness that Mrs. Foster